Hi, everybody. I'm watching you guys start to fill in these little squares. Um, hi, uh, good evening and welcome. Thank you for coming tonight, for tuning in. If you would like the best experience, I recommend putting your computer on speaker view. That's gonna make whoever is speaking right in front of you, so you're not gonna have to search for us among all the little boxes. My name is Marcy Stagner, and I am the Program Director of Cultural Arts and Adult Services at the Memphis Jewish Community Center. Tonight's event is in partnership with the Jewish, Islamic, and Middle Eastern Studies Department at Rhodes College and the Jewish Historical Society of Memphis and the Mid-South. Tonight, Professor Jonathan Judaken and I will team up to have a conversation with Pamela Nadell, author of the 2019 National Jewish Book Award winner, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today. After about 30 minutes or so, we will open up the questions from the chat function at the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions, feel free to send them right in there and we'll get to those. I'm not going to read Pamela's extensive CV. However, I would like to note that Pamela is the chair in Women's and Gender History and director of Jewish Studies at American University. Pamela, I want to start off by thanking you for joining us tonight. We're very excited to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm delighted to be here. So thank you so much, Marcy and Jonathan, for inviting me, and thank everyone for joining us this evening.
Pamela, can you just start off by telling us what inspired you to write this book?
I'd love to talk about that. You know, I think everyone has different origin stories about how they came to do a certain kind of piece of work. And there, for me, really two for writing this book. When I was a little girl and I would go to the public library, we'd have to drive across a highway to get there. And I read all of these biographies of women. I read about Florence Nightingale and Clara Barton and Dolly Madison, and I read so many biographies of women that I assumed that women actually had their own biography series. And of course they didn't. I found out that in the 1950s there was no such thing, but I just never pulled off the shelf the books about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. So I've been interested in women's history since I was a kid. But then my first book was actually about the history of conservative Judaism, and a whole chunk of it is a biographical dictionary. And in all of those biographies that I researched and all the work of the people who entered into that book that I got to talk about, there were only two women in that book. And I said that when I did that book, that that book was going to achieve the objective I had, which Jonathan will appreciate, was to get tenure. And then after I got tenure, I was going to write what I wanted, and I was going to write about women. And I did, because after that I wrote Women Who Would Be Rabbis, the history of women's ordination. And now I did this.
That's wonderful. And if you're not familiar, Novel, and if you're in Memphis, Novel Bookstore has the book we're discussing tonight on sale, or they're selling this book. And Pamela is happy to sign a book plate for you if you'd like one for yourself or to give as a gift. And so she's happy for you to email her with your snail mail address so that she can send you a book plate if you'd like. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Thanks, Marcy.
So Pam, first of all, I also want to say thank you so much for being here for this conversation. It's, you know, I think some days it feels like it's hard to find the bright spots in the coronavirus, but one of them has been the fact that we can have amazing scholars like you come and visit us virtually. And I don't think this event probably would have happened if we weren't in the dealing with this crisis. So thank you so much. And I also want to thank you for writing the book. It's an amazing book. We were talking beforehand about how much you packed in to 250 pages. And that makes it's easy reading, but at the same time, it's deep reading. And I so appreciated it.
Thank you.
I want to ask you about the fact that you open up the book by talking about looking at your own family portraits, photographs of your own family from your great-great-grandmother to your own daughter. And I want to use that as a kind of a vehicle for you to talk a little bit about the larger sweep. How does your own family story fit into the larger story of America's Jewish women?
Well, the first answer is that the women in my family are Jewish women, so that helped in terms of getting into the story. I happen to be very fortunate. I have a couple of astonishing photographs of both my grandmother and my great-grandmother that we had never seen. My mother had never seen them. When my grandmother was elderly and had to go into assisted living, she pulled these out of her sewing kit, and they're cloth. They were printed on cloth. She claimed she planned one day to make pillows out of them. Thank goodness she didn't. They are now safely protected behind museum glass, hanging on the wall of my dining room. And they're taken at the beginning of the 20th century. And my great-grandmother is wearing a sheitel, the wig married Jewish women wore back then, observant married Jewish women wore then, and continue to wear down until this day. And it's very clear. There's a line, you can just see it at her forehead. And the other thing that I know from actually giving a book talk and showing the photo to where one of my former students was, she's studying at the University of Minnesota, and she's getting a PhD in apparel design to work in museums. And I'd always said, when I was writing the book, I said my great-grandmother was very old-fashioned. But now I know she was. The dress she was wearing went out of style in 1870, and the photo is from the first decade of the 20th century. And then there's a photo of my grandmother, and she's about 14, taken at the same time, clearly in the same studio, and she's very she. And now I know that the dress she was wearing was only in style between 1903 and 1910. So, and then I talk about a photo of my mother in a park on a warm spring day. Her back is to us, and she's wearing a black pencil skirt and a white blouse, and there's a baby's bonnet peeking over her shoulder, and that's me. And then I never show a photo of me because people can see me. I've got on a black jacket. That's what I always wear when I'm speaking, even if I'm on Zoom. And then there's a photo of my daughter in tall boots and dressed like a college student, a 21st century college student. And we often think that clothing is inconsequential. It's not. It tells us something about these women. They lived in different times and places, and it's a kind of a lens into their stories. My great-grandmother was one of 2 million East European Jews who came to the United States. My grandmother raised her children in the Depression. My mother came of age at the end of World War II. Her children were born during the baby boom. And I was really lucky. I didn't make a revolution, but I rode its coattails into a career in academia that would not have been possible for my mother, my grandmother, or my great-grandmother. And my daughter is riding the coattails of that same revolution because she's now in medical school. So it let me think and ask questions about how had their lives changed, and then to take that all the way back to the beginnings of the American Jewish experience.
Pam, your stories about your family are so beautiful, and I can certainly relate to that. I think, you know, as I've moved back to Memphis, like we talked about earlier, my considerations about my Jewishness and my family have gone to much different places and much deeper levels than they would have, I think, earlier in my life. And I think that might be true for a lot of us. And something that you write about in your book that is sort of a thread throughout that I want to unpack a little bit because it was surprising for me, is the word Jewess. And I would just want to unpack that a little bit because for me, I've always thought of it as having a negative connotation, but it doesn't seem that way in your book. And can we just unpack that a little bit?
Right. I'm happy to talk about the term. And you may, I don't know if you would remember, but there was a skit on Saturday Night Live in the early days when Gilda Radner was on, and
Yes.
she did her skit Jewish Jeans. And it was definitely a negative connotation. What's interesting about the word Jewess is that thanks to Google Ngram, which is this amazing research tool, you can search across all of the Google books for a particular word, and you can see, you know, how it goes up and down. So the word Jewess is actually used in American Jewish history, and it's used by Jewish men, by Jewish women, by Gentile men and women until about 1940. And so American Jewesses use that word with a great deal of pride, and the first English language Jewish women's magazine is called The American Jewess. And then after 1940, it falls into disuse. There's a tiny, tiny little blip in the early 2000s, and I think it actually might have something to do with the fact that there are some people who've tried to reclaim it, and I know of one podcast at least that tends to use the word. But you're right, in art, and it's an interesting phenomenon of how use of a term changes over time.
Absolutely, thank you.
So Pam, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what I see as kind of the single biggest thread through the whole book. And that is, in a way, this is what structures the book, and that is America's Jewish women have been shaped by waves of immigration. I'm sure that you can't, I don't know, maybe you can take us through all of those waves of immigration, but can you talk a little bit about kind of how, as an immigrant community, the American Jewish community has been shaped, and in particular, how American Jewish women's lives have been shaped through these waves of immigration?
Right. The question about immigration is such an important one, and such a timely one, because Americans argued in the past about immigration, continue to argue in the present about immigration. But the American Jewish community is a community that was built out of immigration. 23 Jews land in New Amsterdam in 1654. There were individual Jews in America before, but this was a community that had 6 women in it. And the minute there are women, and there were also children, we have the beginnings of a community. In the colonial era, almost all of the Jews who come here have come from someplace else, and some had fled the Iberian Peninsula in the wake of the Inquisition, but others came from England and France and Germany, and they brought their children with them. They had more children here, but it's a tiny, tiny community, 2,500 Jews in the colonies on the eve of the Revolution, and that's the high number. In the 19th century until about 1880, we get about 150,000 Jews who come from the German states and from Central Europe. And again, you see the importance of women in this migration, because it's the men who come over first. They start out as peddlers, and when they've made enough money that they want to open a store, they've got to get married, because they need somebody to man the counters while they are out buying the goods and selling them. And so women are very important economically in the community, and then they're very important in terms of building the community, building the synagogues, building the women's organizations. Of course, the great East European Jewish migration, 1881 to 1924, which is really the moment that American Jewry becomes, lay the foundations for the community that we have today. Because we have only about 250,000 Jews in the United States when that migration opens. And then even since the closing of the gates in 1924, there are more waves of migration. Refugees from Nazi Germany, Holocaust survivors, Jews who came in from Cuba, from Hungary, and then of course from the Soviet Union and from Iran. So American Jewish history is a story of the history of migration.
And I do love the way in which, in the course of your telling of the story, we end up getting the very different kinds of experience. So like, for example, I think it's is it the second and third chapter where you talk about the American Jewess, and that's really a story about Central European Jews and the ways in which their lives, by the time that Eastern European migration happens, is so different from the women who end up coming from the Pale and other places. I mean, I do think like a great book has everything to do with structure. And I just want to emphasize again, the ways in which, for me at least, this really helped me to to digest and understand this history where I was very much a student.
Thank you. And I even deliberately called those two chapters parallel lives, because we have the Jews who have come from Central Europe, some maybe in the 1840s, other in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, who are living a very, very different experience than the East European immigrants when we think of, you know, typically the Lower East Side, or where immigrants might have settled in Memphis. And then they lived parallel lives, except that they intersected in certain social service spaces. The well-to-do women in their sisterhoods, for example, their sisterhoods of personal service, helping the poor immigrants to acculturate and to adapt to America. But outside of that, there was no intersection.
You've got such a diverse group of women that you've written about. I mean, really amazing stories and amazing biographies in this book. I want to ask you, how hard was it to narrow down your list of women to write about, and which woman in your book had the biggest impact on you personally?
So the first answer is, and we were talking about this a little bit before everybody came on, the original manuscript was twice as long. So I had lots and lots of cutting to do. And I looked for people who would best illustrate the points that I wanted to make about experiences. I will say that whoever has impacted me the most is often who I happen to be thinking about more and more at the particular moment in time. So for example, right now I'm working on Bella Abzug a little bit, because she's been in Mrs. America, and we're coming up on a big anniversary for birth. So I've been thinking about Bella Abzug, but the woman in the book whose story is the most fascinating to me is Rosa Sonnenschein, the founder of the American Jewess. First of all, because people outside of academia have never heard of her. Secondly, because she was such a maverick. She comes to America in the 1860s with her husband. She settles in the Midwest in St. Louis. This is not a book only centered in New York. And he's rabbi of an important synagogue there. And in 1879, she does something utterly astonishing. She founds a Jewish women's book club. And that in of itself is not so amazing. But the book club is still meeting to this day. And we have a list of, this isn't in this book, it's in an article I wrote, but we have a list of all the topics that they studied since the 1890s down until today. And actually, since we were talking about immigration, that was the topic they were studying 2 years ago. And they read, they research and write papers. And their minutes have survived. It's an amazing organization. So she gets credit for that. But then she's also this maverick, and in 1892, she walked out on her husband. The marriage had been miserable for a long time, and by walking out on him, she gave him grounds to divorce her. Because in the 19th century and until 1964 in the state of New York, if you wanted to get divorced, you needed grounds. So he divorces her, she's got to earn a living, and she's the one who founds the American Jewess magazine, which tells us so much. And then there's so much more about her. She's a Zionist. She goes to the first Zionist Congress. There are about 5 American Jews who go to the first Zionist Congress. She's one of them.
That's an amazing legacy.
And it's an amazing story, you know. Pam, originally when I thought of the kinds of questions that I wanted to ask you, I just wrote a whole list of the names of these amazing women and their particular stories. So since you mentioned Bess Meyerson, tell us that story as well, because it's just one of scores of stories that you tell as these vignettes to open up the broader canvas that you're depicting.
Right. So Bess Meyerson, of course, was the first and the only Jewish woman ever to be Miss America, and she became Miss America in an era when this was really a kind of pinnacle for a young American woman, what one could anticipate doing. But she grew up in the co-ops in the Bronx in the 1930s and early 1940s. She marched on picket lines, but she wanted to be a pianist, and she was actually from Miss New York City, not Miss New York State. She entered the competition because she wanted a scholarship. She needed the money for a scholarship to continue her piano studies. She enters the contest, goes to Atlantic City, which is where they held the pageant. She was pressured to change her name. She refused to do so. When she won, shouts of Mazel Tov rang out in the hall. And then she discovered in her year of reign that many of the sponsors of the Miss America pageant were anti-Semitic, and they pulled their sponsorship. They did not want a Jewish Miss America. And as a result, she actually ended up doing a lot of her speaking that year for the Anti-Defamation League and not for those sponsors. So, and we've talked about this, Jonathan and I and Marcy, we've talked about anti-Semitism is a factor that shapes very much the experiences of some of America's Jewish women across time.
That was actually my next question for you, was this whole thread that you have going throughout your book, and how part of the role of some Jewish women, as you say, are engaging in social activism. And for those who have yet to read the book, what are some important areas where Jewish women became change makers? And what propelled them?
Right. So Jewish women, it is a major theme of the book, is Jewish women's engagement in social activism and politics. And I define activism and politics really broadly. Sometimes Jewish women were change makers in very small ways inside their own families, and also in periods that we wouldn't look to expect Jewish women being change makers. For example, Grace Nathan, who was born in colonial days and lived into the early part of the 19th century, and at the end of her life, she wrote an ethical will, the document that people will often leave their life's lessons and legacy to their children and their relatives. And in it, she said to her son, "At my death, only keep your beard for 7 days." And under Jewish tradition, a Jewish man does not typically shave for a minimum of 30 days following the death of a parent, possibly even an entire year. She was an observant Jewish woman, but she was using the freedoms of America to make a change within Judaism. So I see Jewish women as change makers and social activists in terms of Judaism. I see them as change makers and activists in so many different spaces that we wouldn't expect them to be in. So for example, we'll jump from the 19th century forward. In 1902, when the price of kosher meat soared on the Lower East Side, from 12 cents a pound to 18 cents a pound, which does sound kind of unusual for today, but was an enormous increase. Jewish women who were housewives, they massed and organized together, not in a big women's organization, but on their streets. They broke into butcher shops, they took the meat, they threw it out into the street, they doused it with kerosene, and they wouldn't stop their kosher meat boycott until the price came down. So Jewish women have long been activists, and they get that impulse. As you asked about, where does it come from? It comes from Judaism, it's prophetic justice. It comes from America, the traditions of liberty in America. And for some Jewish women, I think especially some of the feminists like Betty Friedan, it came from feeling marginalized as part of the Jewish people.
Pam, do you want to talk about even more of the areas in which Jewish women were central activists? I mean, the broader labor movement, maybe also feminism, which is the most obvious one given the book, the civil rights movement. This is such a another central strand through the book. And I think in the context of the world that we're living in the context of the Black Lives Matter moment, in the context of the ways in which coronavirus has made more heightened than ever the kinds of social inequalities that we're living in, we're well reminded of the role that Jewish women have played over the course of time in their activist roles.
Right. So first of all, thank you. It's a great question. Jewish women were very active in the labor movement in the garment industry. The shirtwaist makers strike of 1909 galvanized a decade of strikes in the garment industry that left that industry the best organized industry and the best paid industry in the United States. And there's there are many great stories about what happens, how the women spearhead that strike, and how the men don't believe that they're going to be able to do that. But I like to think of one of the women that I talk about in the book, who's a labor organizer named Bessie Abramowitz Hillman. And Bessie Abramowitz Hillman was organized also female workers of color, laundresses in New York. And when she would come to Washington, and she was campaigning with one of the heads of that organization, she would come to Washington. She would eat with that woman who was African American. She would eat with her on a park bench, because Washington was a segregated city and no restaurant would serve her. So we see, even in places where you weren't expecting to find Jewish women's involvement with civil rights, long before there really is the formal civil rights movement, I have examples of women who are championing civil rights. But then we get to the 60s, we have some very powerful examples of Jewish women who went south to secure voter rights. And we have also, like, Bella Abzug, for example. Bella Abzug was the lawyer who defended Willie McGee in Jackson, Mississippi, when he was accused of raping a white woman. And when she was in Mississippi trying to defend him, one of the newspapers published that when he goes to the electric chair, his white woman Jewish lawyer should go as well. So Jewish women have been involved with the civil rights movement and securing civil rights for all for a very long time.
And I want to go ahead and mention once again that if you'd like to, if you have a question for Pam, please put it into the chat that's at the bottom of your screen, and we'll read your question aloud. That's going to be the best way to ask questions right now. Those questions will go to us, and we'll read them. So now's the time to go ahead and start putting some of those questions in there. And while we wait, you had a quote, or at the very beginning of your book, you say, but in an era when religion permeated every thought, marked time, and gave meaning to crises, public and private, that these women were Jews mattered deeply. Can you talk about that a little bit? In what ways did that matter to them and to others?
One of the things that I tried to do is to see the varieties of being a Jewish woman. So there are Jewish women in the colonial days, the Jewish women in the contemporary period, and all throughout, for whom Judaism sits at the core of their lives. It determines who they marry, the communities they live in, what they cook in the kitchen, where they shop. They move from Sabbath to Sabbath, from holiday to holiday. There's a whole nother category of Jewish women for whom Jewishness is central, but it's not quite the same as Judaism. So they won't move from Sabbath to Sabbath, but Jewishness would determine where they lived, who they could marry, how much education they got. Jewish women have for more than a century been disproportionately well educated. It would fix so much about their lives. And then there is a third category of Jewish women that I talk about, for whom being a Jew was inconsequential, didn't matter, but sometimes they would discover that it mattered to others, and then they would have to grapple with it. So it's one way of trying to understand that world, because religion was very important in America and remains very important in American life.
We've got one question that's come in to me, but before we get to that, I do want to mention you're at American University, so you're touching, the lives of many college students, and I would say that is something, especially for college students, when you're maybe away from home for the first time and really discovering who you are apart from your family, that how your Jewishness matters really comes into play as a question that a lot of us have grappled with in that time in our lives. Do you see that with your students?
I do, and actually it's interesting the way you opened some of your remarks about how your Jewishness has changed somewhat since you've come back to Memphis. I'm in that school of scholars that sees being a Jew as a journey, and one moves through life, and at different stages of life, what the Jewish thread of one's identity comes out more. And at other stages, it might be less important, and people change over time. So I definitely see that. Actually, one of my most favorite book conversations, I asked 3 of my students in the fall when we were still in person in class. I gave them a copy, each of them a copy of the book, and I said, "Would you be in conversation with me for an event at the university?" And it's a lot to ask, as Professor Judaken will know, a lot to ask students to read a book that they're not required to read for class. They did, and we had the best conversation, just really a fabulous conversation.
That's lovely. I do want to get to, I think so the questions are coming to me privately, just so that Jonathan and Pam know they're coming in. I want to read a question from Jeremy Popkin. And Jeremy says, can you talk about the contribution that Jewish women authors have made? Do you see a distinct tradition of American Jewish women's writing, distinguished from the literature produced by male Jewish authors?
So let me say first that I actually did not write about, by and large, about Jewish women writers or any Jewish women figures in terms of popular culture, because that is a huge book on its own. So that was something that ended up on the cutting floor. But I do think that there is a very powerful Jewish tradition of American Jewish literature. At one point, Irving Howe predicted that it was going to die out because he thought it was only related to the immigrant experience. We know that he was wrong when he wrote that essay, and that there are certain aspects of Jewish women's writing that are unique to women because they often write in terms about women's lives in a way that I don't see the men who are writing. So their themes are somewhat different. So when I think of, for example, the great writers of the 50s and the 60s, sort of like Norman Mailer and Herman Wouk, and I think Philip Roth might have also a war novel, I'm not sure, but they often wrote about themes that you're not going to find from Grace Paley or Cynthia Ozick, or in the more contemporary period, Dara Horn, for example, Mila Goldberg. So I read a lot of that literature. I love to read that literature. And of course, now it's also very much enriched by what we're getting from Israel coming in as well. But I do think that there is something unique about some of the things that Jewish women, but it's in the topics. It's not in the style. It's more in what the stories that they decide to tell.
So can I just follow up on that question a little bit, because I think it's a really interesting one, and I think it gets at the heart of how you actually wrote the book. And my sense is you're very much a social historian, and you wanted to write a collective portrait of the experience of as many different kinds of ordinary women, but at the same time, you pepper the book all the way through with remarkable women. Sometimes those remarkable women aren't necessarily major historical figures, but nonetheless, when you spotlight them, their stories are remarkable, because all of our stories are remarkable, and you lift them up. So can you talk a little bit more about what it means to write as a social historian, and what your training is, and how that ended up shaping the kind of book that you've created?
Right. I am a social historian, so I'm glad it showed. I'm not an intellectual historian. Social history was about uncovering the stories and writing about the people from whose stories had never been told and were dismissed as inconsequential, emerges in the 1960s. And then women's history emerges in the late 60s, but really in the 1970s. And it's part of that movement of uncovering the past of the people whose past we had once dismissed. So Jonathan, you were right that I was very careful to try to get stories of Jewish women who were not well known and were not famous. I wanted to tell the stories of, going back to the photos of my family, of the women in my family who didn't leave a legacy other than in the family. But you can't write a book like this and ignore Bella Abzug, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Betty Friedan, Bess Meyerson, Ethel Rosenberg. I mean, they have to appear in this book. So there's a tough kind of dance about who makes it in and who doesn't. I mean, to this day, I could kick myself. Cynthia Ozick didn't make it in, and she's like such an amazing writer. But I just couldn't work it in. She was in the draft that ended up on the floor.
I mean, I don't know. I read that New York Times review of the book, which was so positive, and then had that last little line at the end about how you should have written more about Barbara Streisand. And I think in a way, like, not really. Story, right?
I thought the New York. Thank you. First of all, the New York Times review was amazing. You know, it is an author's dream to get a good review in the New York Times, or to get a review in the New York Times. And I just laughed because I thought, I mean, Barbara Streisand was the perfect example. Either you write an entire book about Barbara Streisand, or she happens to get one sentence because it fit what I was trying to say.
Right. Go ahead, Marcy.
Go ahead. Okay, we've got it. I'm going to bring in another question from the chat. This is from Mimi Clemens, and Mimi is asking, did you see a difference in the activism found between the Orthodox and Reform Jewish movement? You commented on women's Jewishness versus their Judaism. Is that the difference?
What's interesting, first of all, thank you. I really like the question. What's interesting is the kinds of activism that Jewish women, depending on their religious affiliation, will take up, and also how it changes over time. So if we think of the women who were in the National Council of Jewish Women early in the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, who are mostly Reformed Jewish women, in that era, they do not support suffrage. They won't take up the suffrage campaign. We're almost at the anniversary of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and they don't take it up because they're afraid of alienating people. And where we find Orthodox women being active is very much in terms of advancing Jewish women's learning. The feminist movement has had an enormous impact on Orthodox women. Their education, their study has been revolutionized, but they're not looking outwardly, they're looking inwardly at the community and at change. So I do think there are differences.
I would second that. That's an interesting point. That's a very interesting point. Jonathan, did you have a follow-up or something?
Sure, I'd be happy to ask another question. You know, one of the other strands that I thought that was really important through the book has to do with Zionism. Mm-hmm. You brought up those 5 women, you said, who were at the first Zionist Congress.
5 people, only 1 woman.
Only 1 woman. Oh, 5 Americans. Okay, I misunderstood. Can you talk a little bit more about America's relationship to Zionism and how it has changed, and obviously from the perspective of American women? And then maybe tell us a couple of stories again about some of the great figures, Joel and Golda Meir and figures like that.
The American Jewish relationship to Zionism in the State of Israel has changed over time. This is what we social historians always say. In the 1890s, in 1897, as I said a few minutes ago, Zionism's not on the radar screen of American Jews. The fact that Rosa Sonnenschein goes to the Zionist Congress as a handful of American Jews attend the first Zionist Congress. And she's advocating for Zionism at a moment where American Jews have not yet begun to embrace it. When Henrietta Szold founds Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization of America, the first of the powerhouse Zionist women's organizations. There's also Pioneer Women, Na'amat Women. But when she founds, and Mizrahi Women, but when she founds Hadassah, she creates it. There's a, maybe scarcely 24 women at the founding meeting of Hadassah. And then American Jews are Zionist activists, but the community as a whole does not really become Zionist until we get to the Holocaust and the German Jewish refugee crisis, and then the Holocaust. I mean, we know that, much of Reform Judaism was opposed to Zionism until we really get to the end of the 1930s. So we have this long trajectory of relationships between American Jews and especially American Jewish women and Palestine and the state of Israel. And everyone always talks about Szold because she was the best known figure. Henrietta Szold spent the last quarter of her life living in the Yishuv in Palestine. Most people think of her as creating Hadassah, but in the last quarter of her life, she was building up the social service infrastructure of the Jewish community in Palestine that became the state of Israel. So she's one of many, many important American Jewish women who went to Palestine, among them Golda Meir. Remember, Golda Meir lived in Milwaukee. She immigrated to the United States and grew up in Milwaukee, doesn't immigrate to Palestine until she's in her early 20s.
We've got a couple more questions that I do want to make sure to get to that folks are sending in. This is from Audrey May. She says, can you talk more about the complexity of American Jewish women regarding race, both slaveholders and civil rights workers?
Right.
Great question.
The question of Jews and slavery is a very important question. And because before the Civil War, the majority of American Jews lived in the North. There were comparatively few Jews in the South. And the Jews who were in the South were by and large not plantation owners. They lived in the cities and they were merchants. So many of them certainly had slaves. They had household slaves. And this is a theme and an aspect of the American Jewish experience. And there's even an astonishing quotation from Eleanor Cohn, who, when at the end of the Civil War, she actually literally said that she was so sorry to see the end of slavery because she disliked having white immigrant women wait on her. So this is a part of the story of the American Jewish experience. But in the same era, there's a woman in the North named Ernestine Rose, who was a passionate advocate for the abolition of slavery, who went around the country preaching for the abolition of slavery. So one of my arguments is that the experience of American Jewish women is part of American history. They are on both sides of the relationships that we have in American Jewish history. And we see the same thing in terms of the civil rights movement. We see American Jewish women who went south, who put their bodies on the line, who got arrested during the civil rights demonstrations in the 1960s. And we also see American Jewish women who were in the South who were very concerned. And even if they were in favor of ending Jim Crow, they did not want to rock the boat where they lived.
Your book really helped me to understand the role of Jews before the waves of immigration post-Holocaust. And as somebody whose family has been in the United States and particularly in Memphis for over 100 years, I've wondered a lot about the history that I don't know, because we don't typically learn about what happened to Jews who were already in America and what their lives looked like. And your books shed such a light on that. And it was just so lovely to read through these stories that aren't often told. And it was just a great window into that life that existed here for a lot longer than we typically discuss.
Thanks.
I want to, before we end up kind of leaving the discussion of race, I wanted to tack back to that and drill a little bit deeper on that topic. I think it's so important that we do that reflection now. My understanding is that Jews in the South and in the North, there was a very distinct minority position that supported abolition before the Civil War. One of the things that you talk about is women in the North who, many of whom had African-American servants working in their homes, and that oftentimes if you were from the somewhat lower end of the economic scale, that meant you were recruiting that help from off of corners from
Right.
African-American women who had come north during the Great Migration. You do have a section in the book where you talk about the ways in which Jews embraced the category of race as a way to talk about the stability of their identity, but you don't talk very much about the issue of whiteness and about like what I like to call the passport of whiteness that allowed Jews to succeed. So many of these stories, I mean, Jews are a kind of quintessential example of this American dream: come here, you know, move around, pull themselves up by their bootstraps. I mean, it's very much a part of the Jewish story. But can you talk a little bit more about the role of Jews coming to America in a country defined by anti-Black racism, and the ways in which this ended up very much shaping how their social mobility in the context of the United States?
It shapes their social mobility, and then because the Jews are also defined as a race, it restricts it. So we have, as you know, we have in the late 19th century, we have a huge debate about the Jews as a racial group. And what's stunning about that debate is that many Jewish leaders and thinkers, including leaders of Jewish women's organizations, latch onto language that the Jews are a race because it enables them to say what remains distinctive about the Jewish people, even as they're trying to integrate and assimilate into the white privilege that they get, so that they see the Jews as one of the privileged white races. Meanwhile, there's a backlash against the Jews as being a racially distinct group, a backlash that we continue to see voiced today. We see already language in the I've seen these cartoons, they're extraordinary, in the 1870s and the 1880s, of language about Jews not replacing us. There's this amazing cartoon that shows that the Jews taking over New York City. It's published in a mainstream magazine, and it's the 1880s. And they've taken over New York City, and you see them literally in the cartoon lowering the sign in front of John Smith and Company, founded in 1820, and putting up the sign of Moses Levy and Sons. And all of the images are about the Jews have replaced the real Americans. So the issue of race is what I see happening in the second half of the 19th century is this debate about, are the Jews a racial group? That some leaders are defending the Jews as a racial group because it lets them retain Jewish distinctiveness. And then there are others who are saying, no, the Jews are not a racial group because they don't want to get into that discourse. They're a religious group. And though even in two of the people I write about in this debate, in their other language, they concede that, like one will say the Jews are only a religious group, but then she points to race. And another one says they're only a racial group, and then she points to religion.
This still seems to be a point of contention even among Jews themselves. Why do you think this is still a point of contention between one another?
Yeah, the debate on what the Jews are, who the Jews are, continues down until this very day. I mean, what happened as a result of the racial definition of Jews in Nazi Germany is that after World War II, there was a real shying away from the description of the Jews as a racial group. And instead it was replaced with this notion of ethnicity, which is actually fairly recent, idea. It's post-World War II. And then now again, and you were asking about my students. After some of the tragedies that have happened in the past couple of years, I've had students come to me and say, what are the Jews? Are they a racial group? Are they a religious group? How does one define them? And the problem is there is no easy way to define what the community is.
There really isn't, and there are a lot of reasons on both sides of that argument, to support really either side. I want to ask you a question about the census, the 2020 census, because I have talked to quite a few people who put Jewish on their census form, and I forget exactly what the wording was. And I looked at it, and this was before I had talked to anybody about it, and I thought, well, do I put Jewish? And then I got really nervous, and that felt really, that made me feel very nervous, and I didn't put that on there.
You would have to write it in under other.
And
right?
But the question was worded in such a way that lots of people put it on there, and it made me wonder whether I needed to put it on there, and I didn't, because it made me too nervous to do it.
Right. Yeah, I understand. I mean, the census doesn't ask questions about religion. As a result, Jews have never been categorized in the census. By the way, there is a new Pew study that's going to come out. There was the 2013 Pew survey of American Jews, and now they've gathered the data for the 2020 survey. I think it'll be out this year in 2020, not next year. But I know what you're saying. It's not just the census. It's like every time you have to fill out any kind of form about racial groups, and then there's that white or other, and Jews, who are sensitive, don't quite know what to do.
We all wonder, don't we?
Yeah.
I think we all wonder.
I think that there is a category of Eastern European, and of course there is a deep irony when it comes to that, because in the context of Eastern Europe, Jews were significantly more othered and racialized and ethnicized, and they weren't quite the same as Poles or Hungarians or Russians or whatever the case may be. So it really goes, there are ways in which being Jewish always disrupts the classificatory paradigms. And, that's illustrated in your book really well with this constant, I think the main way it plays out is Jews were like all other Americans, and they were apart from other Americans. And that's, kind of one of the key motifs of the book. I want to ask you a question that I know is going to be really important for a lot of us in Memphis, and that's for obvious reasons, and you've alluded to this already, demographic. A lot of the book is weighted towards the experience of Jews in the Northeast. I'm just wondering if you think that the story of America's Jewish women would be a different story if you centered the South more, or if the big patterns that you talk about really would remain the same kinds of broad brushstroke patterns that you depict in this portrait.
I don't think if I centered the South more that the story would be that much different. I think if I think broadly about some of the themes, experiences of anti-Semitism, and I do mention Lucille Frank. Lucille Frank, the widow of Leo Frank, was in a different way a victim of anti-Semitism and violence. So I write about a couple of Jewish women who were patriots to the Confederacy. So one who was a spy, one who was a matron in a hospital. So they do come out, but they were zealous for their communities, and they were zealous for what they saw as good causes. And I think those are some of the big themes that come out in the book. So I'm not sure if I centered the South, if it would be all that different.
I think you're making a really profound point there about Frank's wife, Lucille, was.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just amplify the point that's embedded there?
Right.
Why was she? I mean, talk a little bit about what you said about her being a victim also of anti-Semitism. And again, maybe for people, I'm sure many people know the Leo Frank story, but just in case.
Leo Frank was a manager of a pencil factory in Atlanta in 1913. He had come from the North, and he was accused of having murdered one of his workers, and he was in the trial, and there have been films about this and books about this, even a musical, a wonderful musical called Parade. In the trial, anti-Semitism is a significant factor in the trial. There was a sense that if he was not voted, he was not convicted at the trial, that there would have been massive riots. And after his conviction, there was violence, and Jews in Georgia, there's some estimates that say half the Jews of Georgia left after the Leo Frank affair. His sentence was commuted by the governor, who in an incredible speech referred to the fact that there was a governor in the first century in Jerusalem who washed his hands of the conviction of another criminal, Jesus, and he was not going to make the same mistake. And he was sentenced to life imprisonment, and then he was taken out of jail without a single shot being fired by a white nationalist group, and he was hung from a tree. And then there were photos taken of the hanging. And his widow was Lucille Frank. And people don't tend to think of her. So that's part of what I was doing, was, taking out a story. She never remarried, had to earn a living, and the tragedy shaped her entire life. Anti-Semitism shaped her life. And by the way, Leo Frank's mother wrote a letter to the New York Times talking about the or maybe it was Washington Post, talking about the anti-Semitism in that courtroom.
I mean,
another woman affected by anti-Semitism.
I honestly think in a nutshell, talking about Lucille Frank's story sums up so much of what you do in the book, because it's precisely that her story has been rendered invisible, in part because it is a women's story and it's not therefore on the public stage in the same way. And I can really imagine that her life was totally devastated as a result of it. And you're completely right. I didn't know her story. I didn't think about the impact of that. And I think it's a useful way to understand that there are these ripples, but also everyone's story is generally a part of families and larger units. And so I think it gets at a lot of what you end up putting a light on. I want to follow up. Jeremy Popkin again wrote to me and asked for a little bit of a follow-up for my question about the South and the North. And his question was, maybe that's not the best distinction, but big cities versus small towns. Would that be a very different kind of story? And I think that's a really useful intervention, because so many Jews who do come to the South, of course, are setting up stores in very small towns all across the Mississippi Delta. So,
right, and so first of all, Jeremy, thank you. In the period before the Great East European Migration, that is the story of American Jewish history. Is there? Yes, there are Jews in the big cities, but they are creating these stores, and it's the story of the peddlers and the story of the first stores that they open, and of the small Jewish communities that they're building all across the South, the Midwest, and the West. And then the story of American Jewry really shifts when it becomes much more urban. And that's a result of the Great Migration, the Great Jewish Migration, these European Jews who then settle in, half of them are in New York City, and then other major cities, especially on the Eastern Seaboard and Chicago. And then, of course, after World War II, the Jewish migration to both the Miami-Fort Lauderdale corridor and Los Angeles. So then the story of Jews in the small towns becomes less central to the story of American Jewish history. Not that it's unimportant, it's just not as central.
I mean, again, obviously it's a 250-page book from colonial times to the present. You know, I just want to thank you again, because I think that what you do put into these 250 pages is just you learn American history, Jewish history, women's history, all together, and it's just fabulously rendered. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this conversation. We're about out of time. Thank you so much to everybody who's tuned in tonight. Thank you, Pam, for coming to Memphis, for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I recognize some names, so it's wonderful to see.
Oh, lovely.
I know. Yeah. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yeah. Thanks. Good night. And thank you for having me. Good night.
Good night.